Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We'll give it just a second and then we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar topic. Okay, so thank you for joining us for Fire Tree's Family and Community webinar. My name is Amber Biddle. I'm the Corporate Clinical Director for Fire Tree's Drug and Alcohol Programs. Today's topic is substance use disorder, myths, and breaking the stigma. You should see a question and answer box that you can use to submit any questions that you might have. And before we end for today, I will circle back to the Q&A box and answer any questions that anybody may have. At the bottom of some of the slides, you'll see some helpful links, including including a link to our YouTube page, which does have our archive of past webinar topics. So that is a good resource if this is your first time joining us, or if there are some topics that you have additional interest in learning about. Okay, so the objectives that we'll cover today include just a little bit about the historical views of substance use kind of throughout the years. We'll talk about what stigma is and how it develops. We'll talk about the impacts of stigma on substance use disorder, especially the treatment of substance use disorder. We'll talk about ways to reduce stigma and the importance of the language that we use. And then towards the end, we'll talk about myths and realities of substance use disorder. Misconceptions of substance use have been around for hundreds of years. Americans have consumed alcohol since colonial times, where it was a really important part of the culture. So alcohol consumption reached its peak by 1830, with the average American consuming between 5 and 7 gallons of alcohol per year. Alcohol had become easily accessible and affordable to the general population, so it rose to being a significant public health concern during this time. In the late 18th to the early 19th centuries, individuals suffering from addiction to alcohol were considered drunkards and were incarcerated in local jails frequently. Hospitals, almshouses, and asylums were options for housing individuals with alcohol addiction, but like jails, did not actually provide treatment. The temperance movement began in 1808 as a response to social problems resulting from the rapid increase in alcohol abuse among the American population. It led to a new way of viewing substance use, which had impacts on the evolution of substance abuse treatment throughout history. So alcoholism was initially thought to be a moral affliction. And we see this theme running through a lot of the rest of our discussion today. The original goal of the temperance movement was reduction. However, the goal shifted to abstinence by 1840 due to increased recognition that alcoholism couldn't be cured through the use of willpower. During this time period, alcohol abuse continued to rise while treatment options disappeared. There were some, but they really dwindled during this time period. So as a result, religious groups, because it was viewed as a moral affliction, continued to offer treatment services to alcoholics. But institutional treatment of addiction didn't reappear until the late 1940s. So early addiction treatment focused primarily on alcohol, as we've discussed. But in the 19th century, there was a growing interest in treating other substance use. So use of psychotropic drugs was legal in the United States until the Harrison Act was passed in 1914. The availability of opiates and cocaine in particular increased during this time period, resulting in the first drug epidemic. So the Harrison Act criminalized possession of illicit substances, and this really marked a huge shift in the consideration of substance use from a public health issue to a criminal justice issue. By the late 1950s, individuals with substance use disorder were really viewed as people who were not willing or able to turn away from their destructive lifestyles. It was believed that addiction was a disease that could be transmitted to others, which resulted in increased isolation of the person with the substance use disorder. In the 1960s, involuntary and voluntary civil commitment, which ranged from 1 to 3 years on average, was used to ensure treatment rather than incarceration, despite the fact that these commitments weren't particularly successful at the time. And in the 1970s, drug abuse was referred to as America's public enemy. This contributed to a policy approach referred to as the war on drugs, which increased penalties for possession and sales of drugs. These policies disproportionately affect low-income communities and people of color, particularly the Black or African American population, and has had devastating effects lasting for generations. Similarly, we saw negative views of substance use give birth to other anti-drug campaigns, such as Just Say No in the 1980s, which influenced responses to the crack cocaine epidemic. So now that we have that kind of context, what is stigma? So stigma is the relationship between an attribute and a stereotype that assigns undesirable labels, qualities, and behaviors to a person with that attribute. Stigma, things like avoiding somebody, labeling them, or stereotyping, can result in a negative cycle leading to isolation, helplessness, and shame. So when we talk about stigma, it can be broken down into 3 different levels: institutional stigma, public stigma, and self-stigma or shame. Institutional stigma includes laws, policies, and regulations that can intentionally and unintentionally result in discrimination. So this type of stigma can limit the opportunities, resources, and well-being of the stigmatized group. An example of structural stigma is a program policy that prohibits individuals from using particular forms of prescribed medication for substance use disorder treatment. Public stigma refers to attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of individuals and groups. This happens when stereotypes produce an emotional reaction or prejudice that results in discrimination. In the case of substance use, stereotypes often portray individuals as choosing to use alcohol or other drugs, and therefore deserving blame for their substance use and the associated consequences, rather than being affected by a chronic health condition. Lastly, self-stigma results from individuals internalizing negative stereotypes. It's also possible that the people meant to help, including family members and agency professionals, can be unknowingly reinforcing or adding to that internalized self-stigma or shame. Research has shown that substance use disorder is more highly stigmatized than a lot of other health conditions. So these are results from a 2014 study, which was conducted by Berry and colleagues, which found that drug addiction is viewed much more negatively than mental illness, kind of general topics. Findings from the survey include that 90% are unwilling to have a person with substance use disorder marry into their family, compared to 59% for a person with mental illness. 62% will work with somebody who has a mental illness, whereas only 22% will work with somebody who has a substance use disorder. 64% feel that employers should be able to deny employment to a person with substance use disorder, compared to 25% for a person with mental illness. 43% are opposed to giving people with a substance use disorder equivalent health insurance benefits to those afforded to the general population, while only 21% are opposed to giving the same benefits to people with mental illness. 54% believe landlords should be allowed to deny housing to a person with substance use disorder, compared to only 15% for persons with mental illness. And lastly, 3 in 10 believe that recovery from substance use disorder is impossible. This slide is put together based off a 2010 study where Kelly and colleagues were interested in whether the language used to refer to individuals with substance-related concerns would result in different attitudes about perceived cause and ability for the substance use to be controlled or managed. So they hypothesized that there was a relationship between language and stigmatizing attitudes. So more specifically, study authors tested whether describing somebody as a substance abuser increases the likelihood of evoking more punitive attitudes than describing the same person as having a substance use disorder. They suspected that the term abuse might convey that the person has control and is therefore engaging in purposeful bad behavior, or that's how it would be considered. While the term disorder might convey that there is a medical concern in effect, and that would therefore increase the likelihood of getting more compassionate responses or evoking more therapeutic attitudes. So this survey involved 314 individuals, and they responded to 35 questions related to how they perceived or felt about 2 people, quote, actively using drugs and alcohol. One person was referred to as a substance abuser, and the other was referred to as having a substance use disorder, and no other information was provided. So they found that the substance abuser, compared to the person having a substance use disorder, the substance abuser was less likely to benefit from treatment, considered to be less likely to benefit from treatment, considered to be more likely to benefit from punishment, more likely to be socially threatening, more likely to be blamed, and more likely to control their substance use without help. Those were how they were considered. How does stigma develop? The media can influence understanding of substance use disorder, while they try to offer an explanation of how these disorders impact both individuals and family members. So, unfortunately, many portrayals of substance use disorder can perpetuate negative stereotypes, which contributes to a spread of misinformation. So, pretty recently, there was a Time magazine article recently published, and it was titled "What Euphoria Gets Right and wrong about teen drug use and addiction. So we'll use this as an example. The author, Tara Law, identified a primary criticism of the show not showing the diversity of treatment options that were available to somebody with a substance use disorder. The show portrays only inpatient rehabilitation and Narcotics Anonymous as the two primary treatments. Other stances, like those from a representative of the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, or DARE, stated that Euphoria chooses to misguidedly glorify and erroneously depict high school student drug use, addiction, anonymous sex, violence, and other destructive behaviors as common and widespread in today's world. So the Time article disagrees with this stance and cites current rates of teenage substance use disorder from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. In the United States, about 1.6 million kids ages 12 to 17, or 6.3% of the adolescent population, had substance use disorder in 2020. So all that to say that generally portrayals in media can range from glorification of substance use, abuse framed as partying, to kind of a watered down version of substance use disorder, which might be able to be resolved in the span of an episode. It's also notable that social media in particular has offered individuals additional perspectives, some accurate and some maybe inaccurate, about substance use disorder. So a second factor in how stigma develops is a lack of perspective resulting from personal or direct experiences with individuals affected by substance use. So this lack of experience can create a narrative about all members in a group. So for example, seeing a subgroup of individuals as all alike while overlooking individual and diverse experiences. The act of othering commonly occurs when individuals say or think those people, rather than understanding that substance use disorders are quite common. Two additional factors that contribute to stigma placed on a particular disease or disorder include, as we said before, perceived control over the condition and perceived fault in acquiring the condition. Regarding stigma and substance use disorders, it's a common misconception that drug dependence is a choice, which assumes that the person has control over the condition. The person that has control over the condition is to blame. And that's despite current research showing that substance use disorder involves complex interactions of the body and the brain. Impacts of stigma. So the stigma of substance use disorder can have really harmful and dangerous consequences. Stigma can be a major deterrent for individuals struggling with substance use disorder who might want to get help to stop using substances. Research has found that 90% of those with substance use disorder don't receive the help that they need. And additionally, people who perceive high stigma around substance use disorder are about half as likely to receive help from their disorders due to a desire to avoid being stigmatized. So specifically, there are disparities noted for accessing and completing treatment among Black, Indigenous people of color, LGBTQ individuals, and other underserved groups. Stigma can also exacerbate trauma experienced by people with substance use disorder and historical traumas experienced by BIPOC. Stigma can also influence treatment retention and the ability for individuals to maintain a sober lifestyle. Healthcare providers may stigmatize their patients struggling with substance use disorder as well. More specifically, bias among healthcare professionals can negatively impact their willingness to offer appropriate care. Stigma can influence treatment that the individual is willing to accept. So one example of that might be some stigma against medication-assisted treatment, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a few slides. So again, many individuals with mental illnesses or substance use disorders in turn have the ability to overcome their substance use disorder, which in turn makes them less interested in getting help. Individuals might hide their problems or deny their substance use disorder to avoid feeling shame and experiencing stigma or discrimination. So how do we stop stigma or reduce stigma? So education reduces stigma. Sorry, these are a little out of order. Education reduces stigma. So we can learn about the science of substance use disorder, interactions between mental health and substance use disorders, the science of trauma, and the treatment of substance use disorders with medication to be armed against misinformation. We can seek out interactions with people with stigmatized conditions which can change our attitudes. We can invite people to tell their stories. We can seek out media from individuals who have a substance use disorder and are in recovery to be able to have maybe a more accurate picture rather than relying on depictions in movies or TV shows to teach us about what substance use disorder is or isn't. And another big focus that I've seen while putting this slideshow together is working to change our language and our labels. So some examples of that are, instead of referring to somebody as a substance abuser or as an addict, referring to them as a person with substance use disorder. Instead of saying, addicted to alcohol, we'll say alcohol use disorder. Instead of referring to a urine screen result as either clean or dirty, we refer to it as negative or positive result for substance use. So those are some examples, and there are tons available to make sure that we're using kind of compassionate and responsible language when we're talking about substance use disorder. Two other ways are to speak out against stigma and be able to counter misinformation with accurate information, and to promote anti-stigma programs in the workplace and in our communities. Okay, so now we are talking about just some myths and realities of substance use disorder. So there are a lot of myths about substance use disorder. Again, some of these you can reflect on what we talked about in the first couple of slides about the history of substance use in the United States and how it was perceived. But we're just going to work through a couple of these as we finish up here. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that addiction to drugs or alcohol is a conscious and voluntary decision. In reality, it's widely accepted by substance use disorder authorities, medical professionals, neuroscientists, and other experts that addiction is a disease. The American Medical Association classified alcoholism as a disease in 1956, and substance use addiction was included in that in 1987. In 2011, the American Society of Addiction Medicine identified addiction as a chronic brain disorder rather than a behavior problem. So instead of being a choice, some factors that are correlated with the development of substance use disorder can include genetics, which can speed up the disease progression, family beliefs and attitudes about substance use, and exposure to a friend group that either uses drugs or encourages drug use. Risk factors that can affect the likelihood and speed of development of a substance use disorder can include family history, co-occurring mental illness, taking a substance use very early in life, and taking a highly addictive drug. So what about the second part of that? A person can just quit using substances. So for people who are vulnerable to addiction, substance use can lead to profound changes in the brain. The changes hijacked the reward pathways. So addictive substances flood the brain with pleasure chemicals, and that results in a sense of euphoria. And when substance use disorder really takes hold, these changes in the brain erode a person's self-control and ability to make good decisions while sending really intense impulses to take drugs. So these are the same circuits that are linked to survival. It may also be and I just want to include that if this is something that interests you, our last month webinar was about substance use disorder relapse. And I went into a little bit more of a spiel about the brain science of addiction. So our next myth is that people need to want to change, and if treatment is forced, it will fail. So at times, treatment might be mandated by the legal system if a person's substance use disorder factored into illegal behaviors. Treatment might be offered as an alternative to incarceration, or it may be a condition of an individual's release. According to the American Addiction Center's recent research has indicated that about 45% of incarcerated people in the United States have committed drug-related offenses. And about 85% of the individuals incarcerated in prison either meet criteria for a substance use disorder or committed their crimes while under the influence of drugs or alcohol. All right. Myth: people with substance use disorder need to hit rock bottom before they can change. Recovery can begin at any time. Given the impacts on the brain and possible consequences of substance use disorder, the earlier that a person seeks treatment, the more resources they have to use to their advantage. Some individuals seek treatment after consequences like the breakdown of a relationship, getting in trouble at work, recognizing that their use is getting out of hand. So this myth also seems related to another common myth about substance use disorder, that a person with a stable job cannot have a drug addiction. So when people picture somebody with a substance use disorder, they might be picturing a perpetuated stereotype that possibly involves the individual being unemployed, unhoused, involved with the legal system, isolated, unkempt, and the list goes on and on. But the reality is that many people who suffer from substance use disorder function well in society and might even be highly successful. Anybody can be vulnerable to substance use disorder, and many people hide their difficulties due to the current stigma and shame surrounding the disease. Myth: prescription drugs are not addictive or harmful like street drugs. So studies have consistently shown that individuals, especially teens and young adults, think that prescription medications are a safer alternative to illicit street drugs like heroin and cocaine, because after all, they're FDA approved. When prescription medications are misused or taken without a doctor's prescription, these drugs can be just as harmful as illegal drugs. Taking these medications together with alcohol or other drugs have possibly deadly consequences. According to the American Public Health Association, across the United States, 40 people die each day because of overdosing on narcotic prescription medications. The most commonly abused prescription drugs are opioid painkillers like Vicodin and codeine, depressants or medicines used to treat anxiety, and sleep aids like Valium and Xanax, and stimulants used to treat ADHD such as Adderall and Ritalin. So our last myth today is medication-assisted treatment is substituting one addiction for another. So as I said, we have a past webinar that my colleague did that really goes into medication-assisted treatment in detail. But for, for a brief overview, medication or methadone, buprenorphine, and extended release naltrexone are safe and highly effective medications that are FDA approved to treat opioid use disorder. In all treatment settings that were studied, medication-based therapy is shown to be effective. By alleviating withdrawal symptoms and reducing opioid cravings, medications make people with opioid use disorder less likely to return to drug use and risk fatal overdose. These medications are also help people restore their functionality, improve their quality of life, and reintegrate into their families and communities. So also speaking about language, this was a new adjustment that I found, but instead of medication-assisted treatment, it is also and probably preferred to be called medications for opioid use disorder, or MOUD. Okay. So if anybody has any questions, I'll check the Q&A box now. Okay. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Our next webinar is scheduled for September 19th at 12 o'clock, and probably in about a week, we'll be sending out our next topic for September. So again, thank you very much for your time today, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks so much.